Alright, well, I spent 5 rewrites worth of time onto this, project, and because I've been getting the common complaint that I do not enunciate my words, and I speak too fast, I will be taking it much slower today. So if you, think I sound weird or off, I'm trying something new, because I don't want this work to go to waste, right? Yeah, alright. Alright, as I said, this is my 5th rewrite of this script, and I am incredibly burnt out. The original hook for this video went something like, as I'm writing this in my first period chemistry class, the last episode of Solo Leveling just finished airing with its cleverly named last episode, Arise. Now, if you're wondering why I have class on Sunday, that's because that intro was a lie. It sounded better though. Imagine if I said 2 days ago the last episode of Solo Leveling finished. That doesn't sound as great. Alright, so let's get this out of the way. I don't really like this show, and writing about it has pretty much killed me. Even now, I'm struggling to comprehend that it's been 3.5 now months since my friends sat me down to watch this new anime everyone's talking about. Before I inevitably lose my credibility, of which I have none in the first place, I will admit that I have not read the manhwa, nor do I plan to, really. Before you click off or check out, the different perspectives might actually go a long way in illuminating an outsider's perspective, and maybe my more refined palette may make for an interesting video. Who knows? If you really can't stand it, though, just skip to Wombat's part. Oh, he didn't actually have a part in this. Or Soviet's critiques. They should be timestamped, if I could figure that out. And, yeah, take everything for a grain of salt. Frankly, I firmly dislike the show, and no, this isn't rage bait. Kinda. When I first heard about the show, that's repetitive. The first thing TJ told me was, the world building is amazing. These words have stuck with me, and in a sense, that's what inspired me to make this video. Little did I know at the time, he could not have been more wrong. This misconception probably comes from the show's heavy fixation on explaining everything, and in a sense, I can't fault the thought. It's important to note, however, the distinction between good world building and a world we know a lot about. The term world building, and subsequently a fleshed out setting, means a deep and complex one, not one well explained. A shallow world could be very thoroughly explained, and vice versa. The two aren't mutually inclusive. To further emphasize this point, let's contrast DQ11, the perfect example of a deep, immersive world, and this absolute shit show. This will make sense, I promise. By the way, in case this isn't clear, I'll only be talking about writing. Soviet and Wombat were supposed to talk about animation, but that's gone out the window, and we've cycled through like 6 writers at this point. So, yeah. Alright, I have to re-record this entire fucking part, so don't you want to be me right now? As aforementioned, I'm playing through Dragon Quest XI, Echoes of an Elusive Age, and that game took my breath away. Everything it does right, so leveling fucks up, and that's why we're here today. Even as Hero is silent, the story manages to completely engross the player, and in fact, his minimal presence enhances the overall immersion factor. They don't need their main character to constantly spout exposition. Everything is shown, not told. On the contrary, solo leveling completely forgoes every character, nay, everything, for the sake of exposition dumps and plot devices. I kid you not, the magic system, an integral part of every magical fantasy, is just explained by an omniscient narrator in the first few seconds. Going back to the initial argument, less is more. The unknown, I would argue, is equally crucial in a believable world. This mystery plays a big part in engaging the reader, as well as adding an air of believability. That aside, Yuji Hoari's world feels lived in because he lets it do the talking. He holds faith in his dialogue, aesthetic, and writing. to the point where there's not really any further need to suspend your disbelief. At some point, Ardrea feels real. This nonchalant blending of reality with fantasy is most famously a crucial part of the magical realism genre. Here, we're talking about more true fantasy, but the point still translates. Unexplained magic can make itself, ironically, more believable as the characters don't bother questioning it, so why should we? The subtlety and acceptance of magic normalizes it, and in turn, they amplify the story's narrative complexity. Now, I understand I'm comparing apples to oranges, two completely different genres, with one being inherently more interactive, but my argument still stands. The real reason behind this portion was to, in my own way, honor the late Akira Toriyama. If you want a better comparison, though, stay tuned for the major video next month-ish, if everybody doesn't fucking kill themselves again. Free reign. Also, in hindsight, a lot of the DQ parts got cut out in the rewriting process, but that's whatever.
Hello, it's Sovin. Stanley told me to critique his uh, solo leveling video or whatever. And he's currently trapped me in his basement until I finish this. So, yeah. I'm going to be honest. I flat out disagree with Stanley on this one. Although the fantasy genre as a whole has a similar theme, the way each fantasy anime presents itself at first typically will reflect on how the anime continues its story. For example, this might make a couple of you guys mad. That time I got reincarnated as a slime. Although slime is an isekai, and a great one at that, isekai is another genre associated with power fantasy. Its world building is often explained through both dialogue and monologue. While there's an argument that can be made that character and overall atmospheres in both genres are pretty different, the argument still stands, as isekai is the most overused genre in modern anime, and Slime's world building is pretty generic.
Back to the matter at hand, the show's shitty attempt at world building isn't an isolated incident. I've tried writing this 5 fucking separate times, and until now, I just couldn't get it together. The dialogue is just so monumentally stupid, and I just couldn't put thoughts onto paper. But I think I've finally got it. Now, without further ado, what was so stupid about the dialogue? To sum it up in 5 words, this spider has 8 legs. If that sounds unfathomably dumb, I did a double take too. Yes, you guessed right, that's an actual line in the show. I would give more specific examples, but that's way too much work and just pretty cheap. The inherent problem with the dialogue writing is the fact that it's used to build the plot, not the characters. I think I've mentioned this prior, but characters are half the appeal. The overarching story needs to be good, yes, but it's not what keeps you coming back every week. If you want a really good example of this, look at Grey's Anatomy. That show's been running for something like 15 years at this point. The show's over reliance on developing the plot seems to be seeping into the dialogue, and under closer examination, it all really just falls apart. Some pieces of dialogue are so blatantly exposition, and most of the time it's not even interesting nor important. If you're looking for an example, look no further than the bastardization of Mr. Muse. We'll get to that later, though, so stay tuned. For almost all stories, the dialogue is the way to develop characters. It helps a lot with humanizing them, and solo leveling departs from this norm. Who would have guessed, but it does not pay off, and everyone just ends up bland. So, what did they try instead? Quite literally, nothing. This segment ended up more as a critique of solo leveling's approach to storytelling and not really dialogue, but both are somewhat mutually inclusive. My point is, the dialogue hyperfocuses on everything but the characters, and as a result, the story is horribly boring if you're not into the plot. And realistically, who over the age of 5 is invested into this shit? I believe I mentioned this earlier, but in case you forgot, I have no inherent issues with the show's setting. I would argue for the contrary, in fact. I love the idea and its spin on RPGs, but it just hurts to see such a brilliant world butchered by such shitty writing. And the point of this video, such a lack of care. My personal headcanon is that the show's writers butchered the source material to make Korea look bad because of the long-standing feud between the two nations. That's completely besides the point, though. I love RPGs, as you could probably tell, and the limitless possibilities they provide enable fantastic, either definition, worlds. Now, how does one even go about fucking this up then? Half the intricacies are already pre established, as solo leveling uses modern day Korea as a foundation, and the fantasy elements all have been done to death by better writers. So, why? I appreciate the excruciating details it goes to, and it theoretically could be interesting, but there's really not much to talk about. The power hierarchy idea is really unoriginal, and that's not even mentioning the fact that this is a direct copy of every isekai from the past few years. At the end of the day, the show is trying to be something it's not complex, and sometimes it's better to just be yourself. At its core, it's a simple power fantasy and nothing more. That's all it should be, that's all it ever was. Did someone say power fantasy? Golly gee, I was so fucking tired while writing this. Anime as a medium is not foreign to the trope whatsoever. I'm pretty sure that's the entire point of shonen. As I said previously, there's nothing wrong with being a cheap power trip, and to some extent, I can understand the escapist fantasy it provides. I'm not depressed. The problem, however, lies within the fact that the show wants and thinks it's something more. It takes itself way too seriously, and frankly, this thing is closer to Pokemon than anything remotely deep. Mr. Mew is the embodiment of this idea. He's shallow, edgy, and has decision making capabilities of a toddler when making any decision. He never actually has a goal in mind. Of course, that's because he doesn't. He's a fictional character in a show that uses him for his body. As the writer, however, at least try to give him something. A personality, a motivation, or a character arc would go a long way, but I'm dreaming. For the first half of the season, he tries to save up money for his mom's surgery, a noble cause, but once he gets the cash, he goes off the rails on one really damn long power trip. This is one point I'll give to the writers. They do accurately portray what a little power does to a motherfucker. From first-hand experience, his inflated ego is nearly identical to some of the kids I've seen with even the slightest bit of power, and for the target demographic, it's really damn accurate. We'll expand on that later, though. For now, to wrap up the power fantasy argument, even for a show of this nature, solo leveling is just lazy. There's not a single fuck given to anything but the cool factor, and as a result, it's lackluster at best, even for a power fantasy.
Alright, Stanley's second argument. The power fantasy is lackluster. I literally cannot disagree with that anymore. The power fantasy in this anime is fucking sick. I might be glazing, and I don't care. But like I get chills watching the animation quality of the fights in this anime, which is another part that I love in this adaptation. Stanley also briefly mentioned Sung Jin Woo and him taking care of his mother, a noble cause, but Stanley says he does it for half the season, which just isn't true at all. There are some spoilers I'd like to share as a manhwa reader, but Stanley currently has a gun on my head, and he will pull the trigger if I spoil anything.
Alright, I just realized I'm talking way too fast, but I'm not gonna re record all that. Okay. Because there's no logical organization to this video, we might as well talk about the cast. If you think Mr. Mew is shallow, you'll be pleasantly displeased with arguably the worst character I've ever seen in a minute, Orange Hair Girl. If I told you her actual name, Lee Joo-hee, I had to Google that by the way, you wouldn't have an actual clue who I was yapping about. Anyways, the fake blonde, Wiki says orange, but I don't care, is quite literally the worst representation of woman I've ever seen. I'm no anime connoisseur, nor am I a radical feminist, but I can't imagine it gets much worse than this. I'm not all too familiar with East Asian values, nor am I trying to pretend like I am, or to virtue signal, but even then, this might be stretching it. Just as the dialogue rant spawns from one line, this whole critique is exclusively because of her. I'm not even exaggerating. Fake Blonde might be an even more distressed damsel than Rapunzel. If you were to calculate the morality of her screen time, you would find an unusually high concentration of NaCl and H2O. Remember when I told you I wrote this chemistry? I wasn't lying. If that joke went over your head, and I don't blame you, quite literally all her screen time is spent crying. Well, not exactly. The other portion is her getting rescued by Mr. Muse, and if that's not enough, she's a literal fucking healer. In the beginning, she coddles him, resembling a traditional motherly figure, and at times, she seems like a trigger liberal's checklist. Okay, quick bonus stereotype. Wombat mentioned that she talks too much, and I'll leave that up for you to interpret. Before I get canceled, that comment was a joke and does not reflect any of our values in the slightest. The only remotely interesting thing they do of her character, the apparent PTSD, is a complete shitshow and a mockery of people that actually suffer from the disorder. Not a single writer on the entire team has even the faintest idea of what a real mental disorder looks like, and the portrayal of fake blonde's trauma is not only cheap, it's downright harmful. It's so comical and stereotypical that at times the writers genuinely seem like infantile children. Being holed up in a dark room is really their best shot at depicting depression, and at that point, I don't think writing is the career path for you. Wow, it's like they really can't do anything without dialogue. Who would have guessed? Back when I said that adaptation took liberties in expanding the cast, she was the main one I was referring to. Going off the fact that Korea is decently liberal, it's no surprise that this plotline was a result of A1 Studios' interference. Since we're on the topic of female representation, we might as well talk about Wood next. If you're wondering why I called Mr. Mew's sister Wood, it's not because I would like to have sex with a two-dimensional character. I wouldn't, but Mr. Mewes would. From the little experience I had with anime, incest is apparently pretty normalized. Every scene with her seemingly at least carries some sexual connotations, and it's kinda weird. I genuinely can't figure out the point of this character, and thus my hypothesis is that they're setting up for an SAO situation. For those well versed in degeneracy, you'll understand that reference, and if you don't, be grateful you've never watched that shit show. Well, actually, if you like solo leveling, it's right up your alley. The characters are equally shallow, with plot points even more loosely strung together, but at least Kirito has some motivation. We'll get to that later. The only thing solo leveling has going for it, thankfully, is that it hasn't gone down the route SAO chose. Really low bar to clear, it's on the floor, but I would not put it past them. Back to Wood, her entire existence feels like it's solely there for fan service. She's like 16, so that's also kind of crazy. She does get more relevant as the series goes on, or so I've been informed, but her inclusion in the first place feels forced. Let's be clear, I have nothing against female representation, but she serves literally no purpose. I'm pretty sure she's exclusively a character for fan corn, and because of that, there's no point in me continuing the section. Also, thank God I have no clout, because if I was on record saying that last sentence, college would be the least of my problems. Keep in mind, she's definitely something around 16.
Hi guys, I'm back, and Stanley's third argument is that there's another SAO situation, if you know what I mean. While I admit there's some fan service scenes, which I can't really defend, the thought that there's hinted romantic feelings between Sung Jin Woo and his sister is a really big stretch. The sibling interaction in solo leveling, while somewhat unrealistic, it's really wholesome. If anything, the relationship that Jinna, his sister, has is more of a mother-son relationship, as she constantly worries about Jinwoo throughout the story. This also ties in pretty well, as due to their mother being in a coma, Jinna feels it's her responsibility to fulfill that role. The comparison made to Sword Art Online is completely unjustified, as the sibling portrayal in SAO is just insane, in a really bad way at that.
Okay, finally, we get to talk about Mr. Muse. Where do I start? First, I guess it's important to mention his namesake, mewing. I know it's been left untouched until now, so you being confused would be understandable. For those unacquainted with the art of mewing, it's a stupid trend in which one presses their tongue to the roof of their mouth. This supposedly helps grow the jawline, and over time, it should give you a more pronounced facial structure. Before you try this, there's absolutely no evidence to substantiate any claims of any sort of restructuring, and in fact, there's a good chance you're gonna hurt yourself. Because of a drastic face change in the beginning of the show, he earned the moniker, and because of TikTok brain rot hitting the entirety of my writing staff, the name stuck. Because I mentioned harmful stereotypes about females, It's only fair to talk about male ones, and with that context in mind, this mewing ordeal makes a lot more sense. This whole thing, in a sense, is directly pushing, and because of, harmful male stereotypes surrounding what it means to be a man. By making him a more manly figure after his transformation, as seen by his sharper jawline, and depicting his physical dominance, they're indirectly equating your manhood to the angle of your chin and your ability to kill somebody. According to the show's target demographic, it's fair to say this isn't a reach to assume it's meant to exploit vulnerabilities amongst young men, the same kids that idolize Andrew Tate. That's complete speculation, however, so let's talk about something else. I will say, however, that I don't necessarily need every character to subvert stereotypes. Oftentimes, they can act as a familiar, pre-established template to build off, but solo leveling doesn't really do that. Mr. Mew isn't completely edgy, he's occasionally normal, and not a completely blank slate, so what is he? It's more of a weird love child between irony and cringe that, funnily enough, combines the worst of both worlds. He's simultaneously trying too hard, no one outside toddlers finds this cool, and yet somehow still manages to do the dumbest shit at every turn. He does stupid shit, gets his ass whooped, then plot armors out of every actual problem. When I say actual, that's because half the tension is insanely manufactured and fake. It gets hard to suspend your disbelief when every character acts like a literal Saturday morning cartoon villain. Wait, that's what they actually are. If I haven't emphasized this enough, this show is extremely apathetic. There's a clear lack of effort put in for, well, quite literally everything. Up until now, I've mentioned relatively isolated pet peeves, but finally, and I've saved the biggest for last, I'm going to be crying over the plot structure. Regardless of whether I'm even qualified to critique plot writing, the story objectively reads like a third-rate Wattpad, and realistically, I'm not remotely qualified to talk about anything in this video. The writing for everything is hand-fisted, as we mentioned prior, but I don't think you understand the lengths to which it extends. One of the most common writing traps to fall into, understandably, is the overuse of plot armor, and solo leveling isn't any different. Just like anything else I tell you, using the trope isn't inherently bad, but you have to show restraint. You don't need me telling you this, but that's not happening. Every episode feels like the writers are writing themselves into a corner, and what's the only way out? Bullshit. If you want an example, look at the stealth ability. It's pumped and dumped for the interrogation scene, and once the writers figured out it was OP, they invented a MacGuffin to negate it. The show seems to repeat every mistake of every relevant anime in the past few years, and here it's no different. The power ceiling raises itself every single episode, and eventually it becomes so boring. To anyone over the age of 5, I think problem solving is way cooler than flashing and running around like a monkey. That's beside the point, though. Every episode just becomes a wait for the inevitable convenient power up, and it's not well disguised in the slightest. There's no real suspense, no build up, and barely a payoff. I kid you not, everything just happens for the sole reason of plot convenience and whatever the writers dreamt up that day. The night killing dagger in the last episode? That was not pre established, hyped up, or even mentioned. Quite literally pulled out of his ass. You've heard of Chekhov's gun, but what about Chekhov's concealed carry? There's quite literally zero thought put into the story, and frankly, the best comparison to that is of a corn film. Every fight, sex scenes in this analogy, are loosely strung together with arbitrarily thrown in plot devices. Honestly, I think Riley Reid could write something better.
I'm back once again. This will be my last one as I literally cannot be bothered to dispute Stanley's arguments. Why? Well, it's mostly because I'm too lazy and a little bit of me thinking that Stanley's arguments are trash. Well, anyways, I'll probably talk a little bit about each argument he's made and yada yada yada. Probably the only thing that I agree with Stanley is the overusage of plot armor. Stanley mentions the most obvious example, and the plot armor in solo leveling is probably the biggest critique I have that is present in both the manhwa and anime. Another point Stanley brings up is the overhyped power fantasies, and in quotes. This show seems to repeat every mistake of every relevant anime in the past few years in here. To this, I say, Stanley, you haven't watched anime for shit. And solo leveling is quite literally an almost perfect power fantasy. Also, a quick disclaimer: I said an almost perfect power fantasy, not the best anime ever. Solo Leveling is far from the best anime, but I believe it is one of the best power fantasies we are able to get right now. Ranging from the animation slash art quality to the world building and setting. This is probably the best power fantasy that's gonna be out for a while. Anyways, that's it from me. Soba out.
Now, before you go into the comments and type, it gets better after XYZ, don't. Realistically, why would I spend my time watching this absolute cesspool when I could, let's say, be playing DQ? This video isn't sponsored, by the way, but hey, Square. I would love a deal for the new Final Fantasy game. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll be watching the next season for the sole reason of friends, but I will not enjoy it. That being said, there's not much more that I have to say. If you're still a little confused, this show is just lazy. Everything goes down the path of least resistance, and throughout, there's not even an ounce of effort. If you notice the script quality and my voice start to die as we've gone on, that's because I'm absolutely tired and completely done with this. I've been doing this for 2 hours, writing for 2 weeks, and whatever. Hopefully this turns out well, and I'll let whoever after me take over, and if there's no one else, subscribe.